When I'm teaching literature, one of the most common frustrations I hear is this one: I just don't get poetry. On one level, I can tell you in all honesty that reading poetry is pretty much like reading anything else, and you know you can do that. But it's also true that most of us don't read many poems, so we lack a set of everyday practices with which to understand them. Let's say next Sunday morning, you opened your church bulletin and found nothing but a chili recipe where the sermon outline is supposed to be. If you did that, you'd likely think, so what are we supposed to make of this? It's confusing. Well, poetry is sort of like the chili recipe. We know the words, we probably know a little about recipes, but we're not sure what to make of it at all. Or maybe for some of you, reading or hearing a poem is like me when I'm listening to someone give instructions on how to use my computer. I think I'm smart enough and I understand the individual words, so why am I sitting here pulling my hair? Because I certainly am. I know the words, but how they're being used just seems off. It seems somehow a little out of phase. I'm not getting something. Well, what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is offer you a little context for thinking about poems, about how they do what they do, a few ideas that may help you see them as a little less strange. So we'll begin with the question, what makes that thing a poem? With traditional poetry, like William Shakespeare or Paul Laurence Dunbar, the question can be answered fairly easily. What makes the poem a poem is that the lines don't go all the way across the page, that my voice rises and falls in a patterned way when I read it aloud, and it sounds better than most non-poetry. That's all pretty straightforward. The answer is a little tougher with modern poetry or free verse. If a poem doesn't seem to be measured off in even lines, if it doesn't make my voice rise and fall in a patterned way, and if at first I can't hear it sounding much different from my own grocery list, well, what makes it a poem? That's a totally legitimate question. And here's an answer that I worked out for myself. And it applies to traditional and contemporary verse. To begin, a poem must call special attention to itself as language, and the attention paid must reward the reader with delight. If meaning is all that I get from reading a particular chunk of language, it's not a poem. But before you think that's a really narrow definition, let me add this. There are lots of ways for language to give delight, like sound and rhythm, images and figures of speech, even the way it looks on the page. And that's true not only of traditional poetry like Shakespeare, but of contemporary free verse poetry too. The difference is that the delight in free verse is often more subtle. Let's say everyday language is tap water. If everyday language is tap water, traditional poetry is like slugging down a mocha, and free verse is more like sipping a LaCroix. In either case, if a chunk of language shouts or even whispers, "Look at me, I'm not your run-of-the-mill paper cup full of tap water. I give you delight just by my something or other, that little bit of bliss you feel when you're reading me," then that chunk of language has met the essential demand of poetry. Now let me add one more thing about delight, and it's important. As we usually use the term, delight means intense pleasure, but there's more to it. To delight also means to charm. That is, to control as if by magic. So when the language of a poem is making you react to it in a way a little differently from how you usually react to language, that might just be the charm, the delight. Now, in addition to the delight factor, of course, a poem will usually do something else. Maybe it'll tell a great story or a little piece of one. Maybe it'll help you see the deep spiritual significance of some little detail. Maybe it will nudge you towards seeing your world or somebody else's world in a new way. But the most common thing a poem will do beyond delight is help you identify with somebody else's experience. By identification, I mean that the poem makes the reader feel something in common, that's identification, with the experience of the poem's speaker. I think of identification as the "ain't that just the way it is" factor. Think about your favorite joke or your favorite song, your favorite Bible verse. I suspect it's a favorite because it communicates something true and meaningful about your own experience of life. Maybe joy, maybe anger, maybe the lousy tricks life plays on you, and you think, yes, ain't that just the way it is? Sometimes the experience of identification in a poem might simply be, yes, I feel the same way when the sky looks that way in the morning. Or, yes, I feel the same way when I run across my mom's high school photographs. Or, yes, I feel that same isolated, lost in the world way when my cell phone dies at the airport. The level of emotion, the importance of the predicament, the weightiness of the topic, those things don't matter so much. What matters is the "I feel the same way" part. At other times, the identification might come at you sort of backwards. Maybe a poem speaks of something you've never experienced and will never experience, but the poem communicates it in a way that makes you feel just what it would be like. Ah, you think, so that's what it's like to find your soulmate, or see God in a burning bush, or watch a train wreck. Feeling something in the way that someone not you feels it, that deep sense we call empathy, that's identification too. When empathy happens, it means the poem has hit upon something true about the broader human condition, beyond the particulars. That's identification. And because the feeling takes us outside ourselves and places us deeper in the common humanity, it's also a spiritual thing. So a poem calls attention to itself, delights us, charms us with its use of language, and it often makes us identify with the implied speaker. Let me now review a few distinctions about how poems do what they do. First of all, sound. Whether it's obvious, like rhyme, or subtle, like vowel sounds that echo against each other, poetry pays more attention to sound than does prose. Second, there's rhythm or pulse. Now, great prose too can have good rhythm, but poems are likely to play the rhythm card harder and more regularly than prose. Third, poetry tends to make a greater use of images and figures of speech. Although a piece of prose might paint an image or use a figure to make a point, in a poem, that image or metaphor and what it does to our thinking may not make the point, but be the point. So you really have to pay attention. The best poems are dense and they never waste a word. So slow down and listen. A poem cannot be skimmed. If you're gonna skim it, just skip it. Well, I've tried to introduce you to some things that set poetry apart, that make it distinctive. But I want to conclude from the opposite angle. And here it is, the single line you need to memorize from this talk. Reading poetry is a lot like reading anything else, just a little more closely. With that in mind, let me give you 6 steps on how to read a poem well. Number 1, read the poem aloud, listening to the way it sounds. As you do so, underline the words you don't know. Number 2, look the words up in a dictionary. Do it. When you read prose, you can sometimes figure that you'll just pick things up as you go along. In a poem, there's no long to go to, so look them up. Third, trace the sentence structure, or if the poem isn't in sentences, trace the structure of the phrases, and as you do so, keep in mind that the end of a line is often not the end of the thought. The meaning keeps going on around the corner, So don't let the line break mess with your understanding of the sentence or the phrase. Number 4, now that you've traced the sentence structure, make sure you understand the plain meaning of each sentence. Ask yourself, what's doing what to what in each sentence? Now, at this point, note that you're reading the poem exactly as you would be reading it if it were prose, but more closely, a little more slowly. Number 5, poetry is rich in figures of speech, metaphors, simile, metonymy, all those things. So don't jump over them. Take a minute to think about them. If the poem says, "My dad is a refrigerator," think about what that metaphor might suggest. And 6, read the poem again, paying attention to the sounds that are repeated. Some repeated sounds are fairly easy to hear, like rhyme, but other sounds are more subtle. And remember, too, that the rhythm or the pulse, the way the words are arranged, that forces you to read it in a certain way, that's part of the sound. And sound also plays a role in making the poem's meaning, in making it felt and understood. Well, these rules aren't absolute, and there are lots more things to do with you, if you wish, with a poem. But just these 6 rules will put you on your way to reading a poem well, and they'll likely make you say at least a little less often, "I just don't get poetry."